Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Dr.
Sure.
Datta, our chair, is also here,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and you can begin. The recording has started.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you. Good morning to one and all. Today, in this morning session, we have an eminent personality among us to chair this session. She is Dr. Antara Datta. Dr. Antara Datta is an associate professor, Department of English, JDMC, New Delhi. Dr. Antara Datta teaches and is engaged in research in diverse areas like travel writing, post colonial studies, and contemporary fiction. And now, on behalf of JDMC and MGGC and the entire team organizing this 2 days seminar, I, Bidu Bhushan Mandal, Nodal Officer, Vidya Vistar Scheme, Mahatma Gandhi Government College, Maya Bandar, North and Middle Andaman and Nicobar Islands, heartily welcome Dr. Antara Datta to chair 2 days session. You are welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
I extend my warm welcome to all the participants, distinguished guests, and paper presenters to this online session. Once more, I welcome you all. At the same time, I would like to request all the paper presenters to keep in mind that they will have only 10 minutes in their hands for their presentations. Uh, this morning we have six paper presenters
We might have lost the connection, right?
I think so. Yeah, yeah. I think so. We just
Yeah, yeah,
get it.
yeah. Sorry for interruption. It was a network issue. This morning we have six paper presenters under the heading Literary Representations. And first of all, I would like to invite Subhangi Thakur, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Parbati Bai Chogle College of Arts and Science. And this Parbati Bai Chogle College is the first autonomous college in Goa, affiliated to Goa University. And she is invited with her paper, Tribal Subaltern Narrative, an examination of Hans the Soverendra Shekars, the Adivashi will not dance. So, Sovangi Thakur, you are welcome,
Thank you, sir.
please.
Thank you very much, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah, yeah, you are audible.
Okay. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. So without wasting any more time, I would just share my screen. Just give me a minute.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, because of some reason, I'm not able to share my screen. I'll
Okay, no
just,
problem.
yeah, now it's done. Is it visible?
Yes, yes, it is visible.
Okay. So today I will be speaking on this topic, tribal subaltern narrative, an examination of Hansada Sovendra Shekhar's The Adivasi Will Not Dance. So first, let's have a look at what the word subaltern actually means. Antonio Gramsci coined the term subaltern, and it is used in the post-colonial context to identify the social groups which are excluded and displaced from the socio-economic institution of society in order to deny their political voices. So, considering this meaning of subaltern in mind, we can say that the tribals are one such subaltern community in India. Now, when we say that tribals are subaltern, the next question that arises is, why are they subaltern? So, here are a couple of reasons. The tribal population in India does not have easy access to either education or employment. Their lands on which they depend heavily for food and survival have been snatched away from them. In addition to this, because of their location, the tribals of India are geographically isolated from the mainland India. Tribals consist of a considerably minority population of India, making up to 8.6% of India's population according to 2011 census. This paper is dealing with one such tribal community called as Santals. Santals are an ethnic group. Are the slides changing? Just a second. Now, can you see now?
Yes.
So I'll not do the entire slideshow because it seems there's some glitch. So is it okay if I do it like this?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's okay.
So Santals are an ethnic group native to Eastern India. In terms of population, Santals are the largest tribe in the Jharkhand state, third largest tribe of India, and are also found in the states of Assam, Tripura, Orissa, and West Bengal. Now let's move on to the text and the writer himself. Hansada Sovendra Shekhar's collection of 10 short stories, The Adivasi Will Not Dance, becomes an important testament to the lives of this minority community living in the margins of India. Since the writer himself is a Santhal, the stories give an insider's perspective into the life of Santhals from Jharkhand. The titular story, The Adivasi Will Not Dance, is set in the Pakur district of Jharkhand. Through the protagonist of the story, Mangal Murmu, a Santhal, we witness the plight of the tribals as a result of the mindless greed of the corporates. So we see in the story that how their lands have been snatched away from them. So I'll be quoting a few lines from the protagonist himself. I quote, "Only a few of us have farmland. Most of it has been acquired by mining company," unquote. At another point, he says, I quote, "They turn our land upside down, inside out with their heavy machines," unquote. It's not only the lands that have been snatched away from the Santhals, their art and culture, which they take pride in, has also been reduced to mere performatives. They are asked to perform at the weddings and the functions of the upper caste in the name of Adivasi and Jharkhandi culture, but they are a mere background noise. So Mangal Murmu at one point says, I quote, "Which Diku pays attention to our music? Even at the high-profile functions, most Diku just wait for our performance to end," unquote. For context here, Diku means outsider or foreigner in the tribal jargon. Irony stares us straight in the face when Mangal Murmu asks, I quote, "How can all of you be so indifferent? How can you expect us to sing and dance when our families are being uprooted from their villages? You are making us Santhals dance in Pakur, and you are displacing Santhals from their village in Goda," unquote. In the name of development, the Santhals are being continuously displaced. So the question that needs to be asked here is that the development is being done at whose cost? I quote, "All were happy with the progress, the development," unquote. But were the Santhals, the people who were displaced, were they happy? I quote, "We will sing and dance before you, but tell us, do we have a reason to sing and dance? Do we have a reason to be happy? You will now start building the power plant, but this plant will be the end of all the Adivasi. We have nowhere to go, nowhere to grow our crops. How can this power plant be good for us? And how can the Adivasis dance and be happy?" Unquote, asks Murmu. When someone shouts "Bharat Mahan" from the stage, Mangal Murmu asks, I quote, "What Mahan? Which great nation displaces thousands of its people from their homes and livelihoods to produce electricity for cities and factories?" Unquote. The plight of Santals doesn't end with the confiscation of their lands and the reduction of their art and culture into performatives. In addition to these atrocious acts, the rich upper caste Hindus intrude into their personal food habits and patronize them in the garb of helping them. In another story, They Eat Meat, a Santhal family moves from Bhubaneswar to Vadodara and find themselves being interrogated for their eating habits. I quote, "People here don't like to mix with those people who eat meat and eggs," unquote. It is important to note here that the whole discourse of vegetarian food being pure and meat eating being impure is an indication of Brahmanical hegemony. I quote, "Vadodara is a strongly Hindu city. People here believe in purity. People don't eat non-veg, nor do they approve of people who eat non-veg. Tribals, even lower caste Hindus, they are seen as impure," unquote. The Santhal family in the story has to alter their food habits and they go to ridiculous extents to eat meat and eggs. When they go out to eat eggs, they, I quote, "look around to make sure there were no familiar eyes spying on them." And as we move into the story, we see that how the mere act of eating meat and eggs seems more like a criminal act. Though this hegemony begins with something as innocent as food, but it's not difficult to see how Santhals eventually had to conform to the upper caste norms. I quote, "And while it was well known that the Sorens were of Adivasi origin, they conformed to the Hindu norms. They went to mandirs, celebrated Hindu festivals, fasted on certain days, lit dhup batti in their house, and were accepted," unquote. As a result of these forcibly changed food habits, Panmuni Ji, the protagonist of the story, began to question her identity. I quote, "In Odisha, Panmuni Ji could be a Santhal and Odia a Bengali. In Gujarat, she had to only be a Gujarati," unquote. Along with the confiscation of their lands, calling their food impure, and usurping their identities, the women of Santhal tribe are reduced to mere objects of perversion. This can be seen in the story, November is the Month of Migrations. It recounts in a very raw detail the story of a Santhal girl who sells her body for 50 rupees and 2 cold bread pakoras. The humiliation is not only physical, but psychological as well. I'm going to skip this because the language can be a little offensive. In an interview, Hansada Sovendra Shekhar says, I quote, "Why should the truth be whitewashed?" unquote. His deliberate use of brutal, raw language and hard-hitting descriptions is intentional because he doesn't intend to sugarcoat the plight of Santhals. Shekhar, through his writings, brings forth the voices from the margins. In the post-colonial terms, his stories are a great example of writing back to the empire. The empire, in this case, is the corporate bigwigs of India, the upper caste, and the city dwellers of India. The confiscation of the lands of the tribals at the hands of the rich city dwellers is an example of neo-colonization. Through his stories, Shekhar wakes us up from our stupor and makes us witness the unfolding of colonization of our own indigenous people at the hands of the powerful. Since Shekhar himself is a Santhal, he manages to avoid the self-pitying and exotic tone which is usually a hallmark of such writings. The tribal aspect of India that the grand narratives in Indian English writing have often ignored is brought to the forefront through this collection of short stories. Arguably, I would say the most interesting part of these stories is the fact that it not only deals with the hardships of the rural Adivasis, but it also provides a rare glimpse of the middle-class Santhal life, something which most of us have not been acquainted with. So to conclude, I would like to say that Shekhar's stories lend voice to the Adivasi community, which has been bereft of any agency, or worse, have only persisted as stereotype. The stories bring to light the lives of Santhals in a state of constant struggle to live their life with dignity in their mineral-rich land, which has been usurped by corporate and development greed. As Mangal Murmu, At one point in the titular story says, I quote, "We are becoming people from nowhere," unquote. Thank you.
Thank you, Shubhangi Thakur. Thank you very much for your vibrant presentation about the life of the Santals. Actually, your prominent themes include the condition of women in a patriarchal society, poverty, middle class Santal life, the situation of Adivasi people, organized crime, tensions between traditionalism and modernity, the social damage caused by mining and sex work. So thank you very much. Now, I would like to invite the second participant, Father Carlos Luis Sack, Head Department of Arts and Humanities, St. Vincent Pallotti College, Nagpur, Maharashtra, with the paper Mimicry Destroying Indigeneity, a Post-Colonial Approach with reference to I am very much sorry for the interruption. Now I would like to invite the second participant, Father Carlos Luis Sack, Head Department of Arts and Humanities, St. Vincent Pallotti College, Nagpur, Maharashtra, with this paper, Mimicry Destroying Indigeneity, a Post-Colonial Approach with reference to river stories by Arijit Sen. So over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. I'm casting my screen. Just let me know whether it's visible to you. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay, thank you, sir. I'm Father Carlos Luis, SAC. I'm the head of the Department of Arts and Humanities at St. Vincent Pallotti College, Bangalore. And the topic that I'm dealing here today is Mimicry Destroying Indigeneity, a Post-Colonial Approach with reference to River of Stories by Arijit Sen. The colonizers have left us in 1947, but their way of life continues to impact us for certain. We notice ourselves imitating the colonizers and mimicking their actions. In the name of development, the government and the police have worked together to destroy the beauty of nature. This research paper focuses on River of Stories by Arijit Sen and his graphic novel that set out to alert Arijit's contemporaries through his lone art. It portrays mimicking by the politicians and the police destroying the indigenous lifestyle of the Aborigines across the Narmada River since the late 1980s. The Aborigines do not have a voice of their own, and sadly, it is prevalent in our times. Even if they have it, it is suppressed through violent means. I would like to just mention these two books that mention what I'm going to analyze in this visual art or the graphic novel. The West or the Occident displayed to us that their ideologies and mechanisms are superior to the Orient. We started to think from a Western perspective, like Edward Said says, the othering took place. We lost our identity as independent individuals with our peculiar customs, traditions, and cultures. So the only option was to remain in good books with a mimicking mentality. From Edward Said, Orientalism. According to Homi Bhabha, the othering also takes place because we are psychologically fixated at an idea. The statement of the problem is the indigenous population or the tribals depend solely on the nature. They do not feel the need to migrate to another place. The colonizers aim at creating subjects and they did succeed. The subjects only mimicked the habits, aesthetics, and politics of the colonizers without reasoning out why they did what they did. The outcome was the destruction of indigenous beauty, integrity, heritage, traditions, and culture. The colonizers already left us injured with the loss of identity, and we see it still continuing till date. The objectives of this research was to make ourselves aware of the need of authentic representations, to make the unheard voices heard, to understand that we are stuck to the past, to become aware of the heritage that we behold, and to think of sustainable development instead of development that destroys the beauty that surrounds us. Discussion. I would like to just give a brief definition of indigeneity. Indigeneity refers to originating naturally in a country or a particular region. The indigenous population or the aborigines are the communities that stay in a particular place or geographical area. So that is their natural habitat and that is their ancestral territory. The indigenous population depends solely on the nature that surrounds them for their settlement, for their occupation, for their food, etc. They do not feel the need to migrate to another place. The place they live in is their home. But mimicry has destroyed indigeneity. Mimicry is when someone mimics the actions of others without evaluating logically. In the case of Indians, it is mimicking the habits of colonizers. The colonizers aimed at creating subjects and they did succeed. The subjects only mimicked the habits, aesthetics, and politics of the colonizers without reasoning out what they did. The outcome was the destruction, as I said before. Okay. Indigeneity, land and occupation. For the original inhabitant or the Adivasi, traditions and culture matter the most. The oral folk tales like the one Malgu is talking about in River of Stories about Kunjum Chantu is unique and interesting. I'll be showing you the panels that that are there in River of Stories done by Arijit Singh and beautifully portray this, what I'm talking about country. Suddenly we get a different perspective to how things were created. The land and its original inhabitants get a mention in the book. Arijit mentions Juvar, Jinjivi, grass, lizards, Bengali flower, Ningal tree with its flowers which are poisonous, which make for the story of indigeneity. You get to know how creation is correlated and dependent on one another. The Adivasis depend on the nature around them for their occupation, cultivating on the land, grazing their cattle, collecting wood, and hunting in the forest. The joy with which they speak about their village or their home is impeccable. Sahib, this land is our Mata. She gives us food and shelter. She takes care of our needs. We worship the trees, the rivers, the hills, says Sen in page 16, I quote and unquote. Relko, the original inhabitant's perspective. From her perspective, when Vishnupai interviews Relko, she confidently shares about her village. I will show you the panels that beautifully describe how she imagines and she thinks of her place, okay? Which is Balanpur. She reminisces the past, the way she and her friends would swing on the banyan trees, and collect mawa flowers, which would help them to make liquor, etc. Then mimicry that the government and the police do. The government and police and other ministers worked hand in hand. They got their share of the profit and therefore they did whatever was asked of them. The government blindly gave instructions to the police and the forest ministers, for instance, and without questioning, they carried on the given tasks. The police were responsible for torturing and thrashing the people of Jangli. The tribal people were falsely accused and had no one to stand for them. Their land was grabbed by force without any resettlement. Their plight was such that they lost everything. When Reluka Badi went in search of wood in the big mountains, Dule, Andario, Nile, Buryo, and Janjro mountain, they found no wood. All of it was cut and taken to the cities and sold. The colonists ruled India and they left a huge impact on us. They looted us and we could do nothing. They took our natural resources and cashed it on them. They became rich and left us poor. When they left behind narrow mindsets. The government took up development projects and did not think about the people. They said they want to modernize the country, but at the cost of the lives of poor tribal people. For the government, building roads and providing communication facilities was the only way to development. And to provide transport, they deforested the land. The government and police mimicked the colonizers so much that even their language was equivalent to theirs. They abused the tribal people, like Sen quote, I quote and I unquote. No, you fool. What it means is that perhaps your son will get an education and acquire some intelligence. Arijit Sen uses the word Reva, to mention, if you notice in this panel here, there is a mention of Reva. Reva was the earlier name that was given to Narmada. Okay. Attempts at resistance. Arijit Sen decided to take the issue of Narmada River and discuss it in his.
Pardon me, sir. You have only 2 minutes in your hands.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Perhaps he wanted to draw the attention and alert everyone about the issue. It worked as visual literature that called for action against all attempts of the Minikas. The engineer thinks to himself that he has been only a thinking machine so far. The Western education had filled in his mind the positivity of these great infrastructures. But only when he seriously thought along the lines of the people, he realized that these ideas only hampered the growth of the people. All right. Now, these are the beautiful panels that Arijit Sen draws and shows us how this Narmada Valley was, beautiful, and it's been left into shutters now. So this is the thing that I was talking to you about. That they have a garden of jowar, they have their own livestock, they have their own art forms that they are very proud of. Railco describing about a beautiful place. Okay, the banyan trees that they will play on, and the way they will hunt for, etc. The vegetation, their occupation, and the beautiful way that they would sit together and discuss things, the beautiful rivers that flew, the vegetation that they did, etc. Representation like that of Medha Patkar, who spoke for justice for the people who were affected by the Sardar Sarovar Dam project, should take place. She has been an unflinching voice of the tribal people. Representation of any sort is important because it helps create awareness in the people around us, or else we are unaware of the many atrocities. Finally, the tribal people were deceived. They were not given the full information about the project that will take place in their homeland. They were just grabbers of fresh land by mimicking power-crazy politicians. Their attempt at modernizing the village was the same way that the colonizers came to India and did. They entered India and spotted places of their interest and profit and delved into getting those resources to their benefit. The colonizers painted a cannibalistic picture of the Indians, and they continued their efforts at looting India. The same was being done by presented by Arijit Sen. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your vibrant presentations on your paper, indicating the struggles of Adivasi people involved in Narmada Bachao Andolan. Thank you very much. And now I would like to invite our third participant, Sneha Swati, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Kalindi College, University of Delhi, with a paper, Voices from the Margins, and Eco-Critical Reading of Mamang Dai.
Good morning, everyone. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, so the title of my paper is Voices from the Margins and Eco-Critical Reading of Mamang Dai. So the roots of Indian cultural heritage can be traced to the rich oral traditions and cultures of various tribes and ethnic groups of India. However, with the colonial encounter, the written word gained ascendancy over the oral form, and the English language and the Western culture became the markers of modernity and development. Neo-colonialism further created a divide among the newly freed Indians, where the educated modern class became a part of the mainstream, resulting in the marginalization of the underdeveloped and poor tribal and ethnic communities. The forces of urbanization, modernity, commerce, and print culture played a pivotal role in the marginalization of the tribal communities. Now, placed within this power discourse of the center and the margins, Northeast tribal literature highlights their conflict with and their difference from the ideologies of the mainstream India. By virtue of being at the periphery due to its geographical distance from the mainland, the northeastern states of India get categorized and often homogenized within the umbrella term of the Northeast. Now, the diverse ethnic cultures, traditions, language, belief system, and the varied experiences of more than 300 tribes of 8 different states get marginalized and subsumed within the dominant ethnic stereotypes. Now, facing discrimination at the socio-political and economic levels from the mainland and witnessing the political conflict between the armed insurgent groups and the state at home, people from Northeast feel displaced and alienated within their own country. Now, seen as backward and underdeveloped, tribal communities incessantly struggle to adapt to the new changes of modernization and assert their ethnic identity in the face of the overarching Indian identity. Now, historically located at the periphery of two civilizations, the Tibetan in the north and the Hindu or Ahom, that is Assam in the south, Arunachal Pradesh is said to be inhabited by approximately 26 tribes consisting of more than 100 subclans with different languages and dialects. Except for a few tribes like the Khamtis and the other Tibetan tribes that have historically used a written script, all tribal cultures in this region were essentially oral in nature. Now, their myths, traditions, legends, customs, songs, and religion were passed on from one generation to another orally and did not have any written record. The earliest mention of the ethnic tribes in Arunachal Pradesh was made in the official reports, books, and diaries written by the colonizers. But under their colonial gaze as Indian subjects, the tribes lost their distinct ethnic identities. Now, based on the various parts of the region they come from, these tribes were labeled as hill tribes, frontier tribes, and wild frontier tribes, and were often renamed. For example, Adi was changed to Ebor and Nishi to Dafla, again as per the convenience of the colonizer. Now, although colonialism reached the Northeast in the 19th century, the impacts of the British colonial rule could be seen through the new social and economic arrangements established within the state. The traditional barter system was replaced by monetary currency, English Western education system and church was established, and community councils were displaced by new political setups. Despite India's independence in 1947, Arunachal Pradesh, like other northeastern states, had limited administrative control over their land. Now, Adi tribe, is one of the largest tribe of Arunachal Pradesh, comprising of approximately 1/3 of the entire populace. Now, the term Adi is a generic term that refers to people living in the hills. It refers to all tribes around the Brahmaputra Valley in the east and the west Siang districts. Now, Adis integrally believe in Doini Polo, faith that is based upon the dualistic figure of the sun, that is Doni, and moon, that is Polo. Now, with close affinity with nature, Adis believe in a supreme power that governs the universe. Heavily dependent upon nature for agriculture and other needs, the Adis also have a traditional belief in animism, whereby everything in the surrounding, including plants, animals, nature, mountains, weather, water, trees, etc., are believed to have a living presence. Now, they believe in the idea of coexistence rather than creating a dichotomous hierarchy between humans and nature. Now, based upon this idea, their rituals and traditional ceremonies becomes a means of maintaining an equilibrium with nature. Now, a member of the Adi tribe, Mamang Dai, a celebrated writer from the Northeast, attempts to give voice and capture the spirit of the marginalized tribal community in her writings. A poet and novelist from Pasigat, Dai has extensively written about her tribe, the socio-political scenario, and the cultural conflicts of the region. In an interview with Ananya Guha, Dai states, and I quote here, "I am tribal, and the geography, landscape, our myths, stories have shaped my thoughts. I'm particularly influenced by our oral narratives dealing with creation myths." Now, moving on to the next subtopic here, nature. Now, nature plays a pivotal role in the works of Northeast literature. Due to their close proximity with nature and their belief in animism, people in Northeast are much aware of their ecological surroundings. Having worked as a program officer with Worldwide Fund for Nature, Mamang Dai is both aware and influenced by her ecological surroundings. For her, natural landscapes not only have physical presence, but also have a mystic or a spiritual presence. In an interview with Arundhati Subramaniam, Dai states, and I quote here, "The physical presence of the land is very tangible. Beyond this, these journeys here have another dimension. They take me into a landscape full of stories, and my writing is an exploration into this world." Unquote. So Dai's poetry, therefore, is rich with imageries and references to the natural beauty of the landscape. Lands, rain, forests, rivers, clouds, and mountains are shown to have a spirit of its own. In her poem, Small Towns and the River, published in her poetry collection, River Poems 2004, Dai juxtapposes the deathly silence and stillness of the town to the living force of the river. While the small towns lie calmly amidst the trees, nature is shown to be active participant in the funeral rites. In complete contrast to the inertia of the tribal people who are unable to grieve, and natural elements express their sadness and grief. The dust flies, the wind howls, the river holds its breath. The river, we are told, and I'm quoting from the poem here, has a soul. In the summer, it cuts through the land like a torrent of grief. Sometimes, I think, it holds its breath, seeking a land of fish and stars. Now, similarly, in her poem, The Voice of the Mountain, she again presents mountain as an old man sipping the breeze that is forever young. In my life, I have lived many lives. My voice is sea waves and mountain peaks. In the transfer of symbols, I am the chance syllable that orders the world instructed with history and miracles. So the majestic presence of the mountains is symbolic of the tribe's belief in animism. As an old man, the mountain represents rich ancestral knowledge and tradition. The dualities of nature and culture, where the latter is considered to be superior and powerful, gets deconstructed. Here, as we find, both the mountain and the river represent vast knowledge and wisdom. For instance, the mountain says, I know the towns, the estuary mouth, I can outline the chapters of the world. For thousands of years, I know these things as rocks know burning in the sun's embrace, about clouds and sudden rain. Now, further, we see that the transience of human life is juxtaposed to the permanent ancient presence of nature and traditions. Now, while the theme of death is pervasive in Small Towns and the River, we find that no individual detail of the person is being mentioned. Now, in fact, there's a critic called Chinmaya Lal Thakur who says that death becomes ordinary and inconsequential as it loses its power to evoke fear. While humans are shown to be caught in the cyclical patterns of life and death, it is only tribal rituals, customs, and natures that are permanent. Dai writes, life and death, only rituals are permanent. Now, due to its omnipresence across time and space, nature not only witnesses the social transition, but also becomes a cultural reservoir of the tribes. As pointed by Amrita Bhattacharya, the rigid nature-culture divide cease to exist. Both nature and culture are not seen as static, isolated entities leading an isolated existence. Instead, they synthesize and constantly reshape and reform each other. Now, this amalgamation between the tribes and the nature highlights how the ecology or the native landscape becomes an integral part of the ethnic identity. Now, so again, I'm going to quote something from her poem An Obscure Place, where she says, the history of a race begins with the place of stories. We do not know if the language we speak belongs to a written past. Nothing is certain. There are mountains. Oh, there are mountains. Now, in the age of uncertainty and cultural conflicts, it is the very presence of the mountains that gives a sense of relief and a sense of belonging to the indigenous tribe, who feel hopeless and incessantly struggle with the new modern changes. Nature, thus, not only functions as a picturesque setting in Northeast poetry, but also reflects the tribal culture and their contemporary issues. Now, in the wake of increasing commercialization, Northeast region faces the massive issue of deforestation and ecological disturbances. Now, these sociological changes disrupt their relationship with nature and leads to a split in their identity. The sense of anxiety, hopelessness, dispossession that the tribal people experience is depicted in the very first line of the poem Small Towns in the River, where the poet mentions how small town always reminds her of death. In fact, in her book, Arunachal Pradesh, The Hidden Land, Dai states, and I quote, today change has come like a steamroller. The transition from unknown frontier to modern state has been sharp and rapid, and the question of direction and destiny has become of great complexity and soul-searching. Now, in literary discourse, this study of representation of the relationship between nature and human in literature is called eco-criticism. The term was coined by William Ruckworth in his 1978 essay, Literature and Ecology, an experiment in eco-criticism, where he defined eco-criticism as the application of ecology and ecological concepts to the study of literature. Etymologically, the term comes from the word ecology, which refers to the branch of biology that deals with relationship between living organisms and their environment and study.
Pardon me, ma'am. You have only 2 minutes, please.
I'll just quickly wind it up. So Pramod K. Nair defines eco-criticism as a critical mode that looks at the representation of nature and landscape texts, paying particular attention to attitude towards nature and the rhetoric employed when speaking about it. Now, nature in Mamang Dai's poetry symbolically represents both tribal cultures of the Adis and the imminent threat of destruction and exploitation of the ecology. Now, in the new modern age of utter chaos, despair, and hopelessness, the tribes hold on to their tradition as a means of survival. Now, in the Voice of the Mountain, Dai mentions how the other day a young man arrived from the village. Because he could not speak, he brought a gift of fish from the land of the rivers. It seems such acts are repeated. We live in territories forever ancient and new, and as we speak in changing language, I also leave my spear leaning by the tree and try to make a sign. Now, caught within the thorns of modern capitalism, the young man visits the mountain and gives this gift of fish as a traditional offering. Now, in return, the mountain also tries to make communication with the man. Now, this depicts how relationship between nature and tribe plays a significant role in the lives of the indigenous. At the backdrop of the celebration of nature and tribal culture, violence and bloodshed are also central motifs in Dai's poetry. Known for the internal conflict due to the insurgent groups, most of the Northeast writings reflect the contemporary everyday reality of these regions. The sense of urgency, uncertainty, fear, and danger that the indigenous people experience can be seen in the poem Remembrance, where she says, where the danger is being represented and reflected through nature. This summer, it rains more than ever. The footfall of soldier is drowned and scattered. In the hidden exchange of news, we hear that weapons are multiplying in the forest. Thank you.
So thank you, Sneha Swaimam. Thank you very much for presenting your paper very eloquently and vibrantly on the topic Voices from the Margins, eco-critical reading of Mamang Dai. Mamang Dai is an eminent poet, novelist, and journalist. She belongs to the Adi tribe based in Itanagar, Arunachal Pradesh. So thank you very much for your nice presentation. And now may I invite the fourth presenter, Shrestha Bhattacharya, Center for English Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Shrestha Bhattacharya, a scholar, please.
Thank you, sir. Good morning to everyone present. So I'll begin. My paper studies the representation of tribal culture with reference to two of Mahashweta Devi's novels, namely The Right of the Forest and Chotti Munda and His Arrow. In both these works, culture is not merely a depoliticized form of aesthetic expression, but rather a mode of asserting political resilience that challenges state-sponsored violence against marginalized tribal subjects. Consequently, they end up enacting what Brahma Prakash, following Sharmila Rege, has termed as cultural labor. In his work on the cultural practices of the various marginalized sections of India, Prakash questions the commonsensical understanding that sees culture and labor as antagonistic concepts. To counter this elitist discourse, Prakash coins the term cultural labor, which he describes as, and I quote, popular cultural performances which are embedded in the materiality of caste and labor and are constitutive of manual labor in Indian society. Quote closed. By equating the materiality of labor with art, Prakash not only highlights the revolutionary purpose of artistic practices, but also acknowledges the active role that the marginalized may play in the production of culture. Following his concept, my paper would explore how the idea of tribal cultures, as depicted in Devi's novels, disrupt bourgeois ideals of arts and aesthetics. As a wider concern, I'd also study how the cultural labor of the Munda tribe, which is a tribe that Devi portrays in her novels, can provide a useful category to help us reconfigure our understanding of modernity and progress. So, set in the backdrop of the 19th century Munda revolution, The Right of the Forest traces the birth, life, and death of Birsa Munda, the mytho-historical leader of the Munda tribe inhabiting the Chotanagpur Plateau region. The corrupt practices of the British government and their Indian allies, the Dikus, that is the elite upper class group, composed mostly of landlords and moneylenders, threatened to displace the Munda tribe from their land and culture by interfering with their socioeconomic existence. As his tribe anticipates cultural extinction, Birsa realizes that the only way for the Mundas to reclaim their spaces back is to vehemently reassert their identity. To realize his vision of the Ulgulan or the Great Rebellion, Birsa turns the protest into a ritual. He seeks to inculcate in his followers a sense of pride in their Munda identity. Therefore, singing, dancing, and playing instruments becomes as integral to the movement as the act of developing strategies to defeat the enemy. Birsa goes on to modify the old customs of his tribe so that they remain in tune with the spirit of the revolution. Songs of celebration are modified into revolutionary songs about overthrowing the oppressive British government as well as the Dikhus. Instead of being a constricting force then, traditions become a source of liberation against injustice perpetrated by the outsiders by portraying the quote-unquote black-skinned, almost naked Mundas as an organized collective capable of challenging the very foundations of the empire. Devi challenges the arbitrary standards of progress, which place more value on superficial markers of modernity. Birsa's mythification is also greatly owes itself to the tradition of the oral. The function of characters like Shivan, Sunara, Dhani, Bharmi, and Sali is primarily choral in nature. The novel begins with Birsa's death, and it is through the dialogues of these characters and not through omniscient third-person narration that his life and vision are unraveled before the reader. It is almost as if Birsa gets resurrected from death and comes alive before the reader as the choral characters reminisce about their god. In addition to that, Birsa also remains a constant presence in the popular imagination of the Mundas as the subject of the songs that the Birsaites compose and sing as they prepare for the Ulgulan. These repeated oral references to Birsa take him out of his flesh and blood existence and transform him into a myth, a legend, an idea. In this way, Birsa attains a sort of immortality that is indispensable for his ideas to live on even after he passes away. Even after Birsa's death, Dhani and Sali emphatically declare at different points of time, Ulgulan doesn't end, God doesn't die. So Birsa dies, his legend lives on. This immortal quality of Birsa's legend is further underscored by Devi in Chotti Munda and his arrow. The novel centers around his eponymous hero who, despite being born around 15 odd years after the Ulgulan, serves as, and I quote, a figure of continuity from the Ulgulan to the emergency and post-emergency. For Chotti, who is exceptionally skilled in archery, his lifelong commitment to the sport is not merely a matter of recreation, rather, it is a mode of political assertion. Chotti's first brush with archery occurs when he meets Dhani Munda, his sister's grandfather-in-law. Keen to win the archery competition in the village tribal fair, Chotti requests Dhani to teach him the craft. However, what begins as a leisurely and somewhat frivolous pursuit for Chotti soon becomes a vital part of his and his tribe's political subjectivity. An aid of Birsa in the cause of Ulgulan, Dhani regales Chotti with the stories of the Ulgulan and other tribal uprisings. He stirs Chotti's consciousness by repeatedly emphasizing upon the present misfortunes of Mundas under the regime of the government Dikhu Nexus. This, in fact, is a conscious exercise of cultural labor on Dhani's part that motivates him to impart archery lessons to the young Chotti. As the narrator notes, there's something that drives Chotti inside. Now, Chotti's brilliance as an archer soon elevates him to the status of a quasi-mythical figure, as everyone around him takes his skills to be a product of magic and attributes his wins at the archery competitions to the supernatural. Unlike Birsa, whose self-mythification was a conscious strategy to organize and orchestrate the Munda uprising, Chotti's initial inclusion as the subject of tribal myth and lore is largely inadvertent on his part. In fact, he even tries to dissuade the other Mundas from regarding him as a magician. His skills, he insists, come from nothing but practice. However, as the Mundas are confronted with several forms of oppression, be it perpetrated by the British Raj, the Dikhu moneylenders and land-owning zamindars, or the post-independence Indian government. Myth-making becomes a deliberate strategy that endangers subaltern resistance. In each of these instances becomes a story about Choti Munda's life. As the narrator repeatedly states throughout the course of the narrative, everything is a story in Choti Munda's life. The first of such examples is when Lala Baijnath, the local landowning moneylender, calls Bisra, not to be confused with Birsa. Bisra is Choti's father, a Mahajan. That is
Pardon,
money.
pardon me, please. You have to complete within 2 minutes, please.
Yes, sir. Perceiving it as an insult, Bisra enters into an argument with the Lala, provoking Lala to get Bisra arrested. However, interestingly, the rumors surrounding Choti's spelled arrow effectively strike a fear in the heart of the powerful moneylender. Meanwhile, Bisra, unable to bear the humiliation, dies by suicide. The Lala, fearing Choti's magical vengeance, decides to leave his business to his son Tirthanath and relocate to Banaras, where he eventually meets his death by an accident, thus further strengthening the lore surrounding Choti's magical powers. While Choti's life is filled with many such oral legends, two of them need to be mentioned. The first of such examples is the case of Dukhya. Dukhya, one of Choti's students, kills his Dikhu boss after the latter insults his tribal heritage. Dukhya gets arrested, and his relationship with Choti further solidifies the mythical nature of Choti's arrow. In another such incident, the tribal inhabitants of the Kurmi village take massive loans and commit themselves to a life of bonded labor, only to convert to Christianity en masse, which frees them from the obligations of their contract and leave the village. This act of strategic maneuver, too, gets attributed to Choti and his magic arrow. These incidents merit a closer analysis for at least two reasons. Firstly, the process of myth formation is directly related to orality, a quintessential characteristic of Munda culture. Since the Munda language does not have a written script, it is through oral legends and songs that Choti's legends remain documented and get circulated from person to person. Secondly, and perhaps more significantly, all of these situations involved a Munda or a group of Mundas securing victory over their oppressors. Dukhya, for example, manages to slay his exploitative employer and voluntarily hands himself over to the police. The strategic planning of the Kurmi villagers not only helps them to dismantle the existing hold of the bonded labor system over them, but also enables them to trick their oppressor out of his money. It needs to be noted that the involvement of Choti in the last two cases is indirect at best, yet his name seemingly manages to get intertwined with all other instances of tribal resistance in Devi's novel. Various events of successful subaltern resistance therefore get condensed and coalesced within a single figure, namely Choti Munda, who wields a magical arrow. By creating an infallible, all-powerful mythical figure whom they derive their inspiration from, the Mundas managed to forge their own symbol of resistance against the various manifestations of power that seek to commodify and subdue their existence. Interestingly, while the other Mundas celebrate the magic of their leader, Choti himself repeatedly rues that his helplessness and points out the irrationality behind the idea of a so-called magical spell. The following instance makes it clear. Talking to Daroga, a symbol of authority, a tribal man exclaims, "There's an Adivasi here, our pride and joy, a magician with the arrow, that is Choti Munda." Choti's mythification then ceases to be an act of mere make-believe by primitive, savage tribals and instead represents a tactfully constructed mode of subaltern self-subjectification. The political currency generated by Choti's mythification reaches its culmination in the novel's climax when the government at the center prohibits the practice of bonded labor. The highly casteist Dikhu administration nexus try their best to prevent the implementation of the ban. A struggle breaks out between the tribals and Dikhu.
Pardon me. I am sorry to say that you have to wind up.
Yes, sir. I'll wind up. The police follow the Mundas to the annual archery competition, seeking to identify and incarcerate the culprit tribals. It is at this moment that Choti finally partakes in his own mythification. He participates in the competition and hits the target, while prohibiting the others from doing so, thereby identifying himself as an active participant in the struggle. However, instead of surrendering, he stirs up a remarkable show of solidarity, and the novel ends with Choti on one side, the SDO on the other, and in between 1,000 bows upraised in space. The transition from the cultural to the political is therefore complete. To conclude, I would say that the performance of cultural labor in Davies' novels transcends its immediate context. For the Mundas who lie at the periphery of the society, it is only by performing history that they can construct their own historiography. The tribals in Davies' novels engage in what Adrian Rich calls revision, whereby indigenous modes of knowledge production give rise to a subversive form of discourse that questions the dominant modes of storytelling. By portraying the tribals as politically aware agents who actively force their unique mode of resistance, Mahashweta Devi deliberately complicates the commonplace categories like tradition, modernity, center, and periphery. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sneha, for presenting your paper very eloquently and vibrantly on the topic. Resistance, Performance and Cultural Labor, reading Mahashweta Devi's The Rite of the Forest and Choti Munda and his Arrow. And if I am not wrong, this Choti Munda and his Arrow by Mahashweta Devi is one of the most outstanding Bengali novel originally written in Bengali under the title Choti Munda Otar Tir in 1980. So thank you very much for your nice presentation. And now may I invite the fifth presenter of this day, Sneha Umari, an scholar of MA English second year, Parvati Bai Chogle College of Arts and Science, Goa University, with the topic, the post-colonial reading of Goan tribes through personal narratives. So over to you, Sneha Umari, please.
Yes, sir. Good morning, everyone. And my name is Sneha Umari. I study in Parvati Bai Chogole College. I'll be sharing my screen. Just let me know if you can see it.
Yeah, please.
Is it visible?
Yeah, it is visible.
Okay.
Yeah, continue.
So, the topic for my paper is the post-colonial reading of Goan tribes through personal narratives. So as we all know, post-colonialism originated and progressed from strained cultural relationships that were shared between Africa, Asia, and the Western world. And it is by using the political and economic strength, Great Britain dominated among its colonies. So much of the post-colonial theory is concerned with the residual forms of colonial authority after the end of the empire, that is the post-colonial period. And therefore, post-colonialism is one of those theories which is still relevant and applies to the ongoing struggles. Now, post-colonial theory has been used and found in examining a variety of colonial relationships beyond the classic colonization of the British Empire. So the concept of boundaries and margins has been crucial in the domination of indigenous spaces. When we think of inferior groups, we automatically think of the subalterns. That includes a wide range of groups, including the Dalits, the tribes, transgender, etc. So keeping this perspective in mind, my research paper attempts to analyze the contemporary narratives of Goan tribes through the post-colonial lens. So the agenda for my presentation is, I'll be talking about the aim of my paper. Then I'll give you a brief idea about Goa, its colonial past, and the tribes of Goa. Then we will explore some of the narratives that I had chosen for the research paper. Next, we will do a post-colonial reading with reference to 3 factors which I have chosen to analyze the narratives. The first one is the process of othering. then the discrimination of the tribals in terms of their language, and writing back, followed by the conclusion. So this paper attempts to analyze the contemporary narratives of two Goan tribes through post-colonial lens. So these personal narratives have been chosen from a blog series named as How Kon. How Kon means who am I, okay? And it is a researching of the self. So How Kon is basically a series of blogs written by the tribes, which is an exploration of their identity. The paper attempts to highlight some of the specific aspects of post-colonialism, like language, the practice of othering, and the process of writing back. An attempt is made to understand these concepts through the perspectives of tribal community who have always been subjugated to discrimination. The paper will focus on life experiences, culture, pain, and injustice faced by the tribes at the hands of the dominant mainstream groups. Now, about Goa. We all know it is the smallest state in India, and despite of being the smallest state, it was under direct control and it has an extensive history with India. Okay, so it has been ruled over by Kadamba dynasty, rulers of Deccan and Vijayanagar kingdom, and the final invasion of Goa occurred in 1510 when Portuguese reached India, and Goa was attacked in 1510 under Albuquerque. So that's the picture of him, and the colonizers took keen interest in Goa because the Goan tribals had a Gaonkari system, and the colonizers saw this as a major means to gain revenue. And later, this Gaonkari system was changed to Comunidad, where the ownership of lands went into the hands of the affluent class. So through the systematization and the power that colonizers had, intellectual power as well as the colonial power, this helped them to transfer large quantities of land into the hands of the affluent class, and this is when the Goan tribals lost their ownership to the land. Now, I move on to the types of tribes. So there are 4 tribes in Goa: the Gaudas, the Kunbis, Velebs, and the Dhangas. They belong to the Proto-Australoid group of tribes, and they constitute the 10% population of Goa. Poverty, exploitation, economic and technological backwardness, socio-cultural difficulties are some of the problems faced by these communities till today. They are alienated from their own lands. The tribal communities continue to be marginalized, and these marginalized tribes have recently begun to speak, and hence they challenge the dominant culture and the dictates. They try to highlight the eminent emerging voices of the folk, though silent, resonating their tribal identity about their race and pride, their ethnicity, their history, and cultural traditions. I move on to the narratives that I have chosen for the research paper. So the first narrative is...
Pardon me, please, you have only 2 minutes.
Okay. So the first narrative is To Gauda or Not to be Gauda by Favita Dias, who herself is a tribe, and she is in this constant identity conflict, who is trying to identify with her Gauda community, and she is saying that she regrets discovering her tribal identity because it puts her into constant conflict. The second narrative is Where Have All the Rituals and Songs Gone? So in this narrative, we see Gauda community dropping off all their traditions and customs in order to imitate the customs that are accepted by the civilized, so-called civilized. And the third narrative is Veep Writes Back. So Veep is a sub-tribe of Kumbi community, and they struggle to get equal rights like all others. So the impact of colonization on these communities is seen through the process of othering, when they are being othered in terms of lifestyle, identity, language, and culture. They face discrimination based on language. So the original language of Goa is Konkani, and these tribals have preserved this language, but it is ironic to see that they are being discriminated for the preservation of this original language. And writing back a scene when these narratives are written by the tribes, they choose to make their voice heard, and they write for their community. Moving on to the conclusion, discrimination and inequality still reside in the society, and it is carried out in very subtle ways. Personal narratives like these have provided an insider's perspective, and hence they give voice to the unheard. We see the oppressed, that is the tribes, for example, they choose defiance over silence in the contemporary era. Access to education has made this very easy for them to make their voices heard, and hence the narratives can be read through the post-colonial lens, as they are born out of frustrations, fears, and hopes, and the dreams of the colonized. Thank you.
Thank you, Sneha, for your vibrant presentation on your topic. Thank you very much. And now may I request the last presenter of the session, Galicia Rodriguez, a scholar, Department of English, Parbati Bai Chogle College of Arts and Science, Goa University, with the paper Myth of Development in Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Tribal Communities as Seen in Pankaj Sexaria's The Lost Web and Island novel. So over to you, please. Galicia Rodriguez. Are you there? Galicia Rodriguez, are you there? Over to you, please. Ankan, sir. Hello.
Yes, sir. She is unmuted. I think there's a problem with her
Yeah.
headphones. I think please.
Yeah. Please try to solve, please.
Am I audible now?
Yeah. You're audible. Please continue.
Okay, fine. I'll just present my screen. Are you all able to view my presentation?
Yeah. Continue, please.
Okay. I'm just so sorry for this inconvenience. Yeah. My name is Alyssa Rodriguez, and I'm currently pursuing my master's at Parvatibai Jogle College of Arts and Science. And today I'll be presenting my paper, that is the myth of development in Andaman and Nicobar Islands, tribal communities as seen in Pankaj Seksaria's a novel, that is the Last Wave, an Allen novel. So what does one think of when one hears the Andaman and the Nicobar Islands? It's usually this archipelago with a very pristine water, sparkling yellow sands, abundant reserve of tropical flora and fauna. This is what one usually thinks. But however, the reality is very far from the exotic image that is being portrayed. So I have used the text, that is Orientalism, and applied to Pankaj Seksaria's novel. And Orientalism is a system of knowledge which provides information about the binary between the Western and the Eastern countries. The West has divided the world into us and theirs, superior and inferior. Hence, keeping this concept of Orientalism in mind, the tribal communities of the Andaman and the Nicobar Islands are considered inferior by the administration, as well as the settlers who have now considered them as superior. So the mainland India and the administration are here seen as the dominating powers that have enormously and systematically, they discipline and manage the tribe and the ever-changing lands. So just as the Occident used Orientalism as a corporate institute to discuss, analyze the Orient by making statements, authorizing views, teaching and settling and ruling over it, the same is being done by the mainland India and the administration on the islands. So without knowing the horrific condition of the islands and the indigenous population, one cannot account for the authoritative position of the administration imposed on tribal life. So it can be considered that the indigenous inhabitants are not free subjects, and they have been pushed further into the deeper regions of the evergreen tropical forests on the island. So I have worked on the novel, that is the Last Wave, an Allen novel by Pankaj Seksaria, and this is his debut novel. This is a work of fiction that deals with the tribal discourses of the Andaman and the Nicobar Island. The author uses an engaging poignant tale to narrate and instigate meta-core discourses of the island, which otherwise are not considered worthy of discourse in the mainland India, as these islands are only meant for tourism and administrative purposes. So this book gives an account of the firstborn of the islands, the locals, the immigrants who have come to the island, as well as the invasion of the colonial powers, that first is the Japanese, followed by the British, and now you have the Indian continent and the administration who are further driving it to the edge. And all this is beautifully narrated through a love story. The novel, so far since yesterday we have spoken about the Great Andamanese, but this novel specifically talks about, extensively focuses on the Jarawa tribes who live in the South and Middle Andamans, and the Andaman Trunk Road runs through these areas. So this tribe depends on hunting and gathering for their daily survival, and they are protected under the Jarawa policy implemented by the Ministry of Home Affairs, Government of India, in consultation with the Ministry of Tribal Affairs and Andaman and Nicobar administration. So the Jarawas consider the forest as their home and are well versed with every nook and corner of it. So in the novel, it is said, there's an instance where they are said the experts in collecting honey by using the leaves of a tomle plant, and they do not get stung by the leaves, by the bees. So it's just that their knowledge about the forest is so vast, and somehow the settlers have romanticized the Jarawas' knowledge on the forest. I quote, this is from the book, they don't take our medicines even. They know everything about the forest. It's like their bazaar. End quote. The settlers have exhausted the Jarawas as the spirits of the forests. At the same time, they see them as very aggressive and someone not to be trusted. And they're entirely capable of plotting, planning, scheming, and scheduling. So, and times they are said to be even. Now, this was the quote that was said by Dr.
Pardon me,
Pandya.
Miss Galecia,
It's there in the
but
book.
pardon me,
They
please, please. You have to
yes,
finish within 1 minute, please. We are
yeah,
time.
so they are jungly. It depends on what we mean. Those living in the forest, in the jungles are junglis, like those living in the villages are villagers. But by junglis, if we mean savages, uncivilized people, that they are not. So the settlers have failed to recognize the indigenous inhabitants as human beings who are native to the forest. So despite the fact that the tribal people have the same physical features as the settlers, they are seen as the others. So in Orientalism, where you have the brown man learning from the white man, here we have the black man learning from the brown. And the Jarawas are seen as the burden to the settlers and are needed to be taught how to live a civilized life. However, they are far from being uncivilized people. The settlers have failed to understand and accept the Jarawas as their own, that they have their own way of living and their culture. And the mysterious ways of the Jarawas have led to people, build myths around them. And one of such myths is that the saliva of the Jarawa was poisonous and they would spit and kill someone. So as the novel talks about the direct and the indirect encounters between the settlers and the Jarawas, historically the Jarawas did shoot arrows and attack any encroacher who attempted to encroach. Now these forests were their home, and but now as time went by, the tribal folks have started emerging from the depths of the forest, and they have started to initiate social relations with the settlers. So the author now shows that how these two distinct cultures react to each other through the narration of this tragic tale stirred with fiction and some real life incidents. So it is clearly evident that the settlers, however, have less compassion towards the Jarawas. Because when there is an instance in the book where they have moved their settled establishment closer to the Andaman Trunk Road, and here now the settlers have exploited them for their own benefits to just gain profit to tourism. And they have blatantly advertised the indigenous people as a commodity and promoted them by using the phrases like, I quote, see and feel the primitive dark tribe of the Andaman forests, a once in a lifetime opportunity of meeting primitive naked people, end quote. So, and these forests have also been exploited for timber extraction, and the island itself is losing its ecology, and its evergreen forests are turning into a deciduous forest. Now, the Andaman Trunk Road is also a road that represents everything that is wrong for the Jarawas. So finally, the conclusion, it is pertinent to point out that any literary text cannot be detached from its politics. Thus, similarly, this too novel cannot be detached from the politics. Shakespeare not only holds the British accountable, but India as well for the rapid dwindling state of the India as well as of the indigenous population and its ecology. India is the neo-colonizer responsible for the imbalance in the ecosystem of this fragile archipelago as well as it is formed to tame and civilize whatever is wild in the ecological community. So through his fictional novel, The Last Wave, he draws a metaphorical connection between the disastrous tsunami waves that had caused great pain and loss of life and property in 2004 and to the exploitation of the Jarawa tribal community in the name of development that the Indian continent imposed on them and their territory. Shakespeare speaks on the behalf of these voiceless tribal communities, in particular the Jarawa tribe. The language barrier is another hindrance as we fail to understand them. Hence, there lies a need to educate a deal that helps the Jarawas to negotiate with the outside world, and especially the outside world to understand the lives of the Jarawas. So, illegal and criminal activities such as timber cutting, poaching are still being carried out in this massive evergreen forest. Thus, there is still continuous colonization of the Andaman and the Nicobar Islands. And the threat to the tribal people and the island ecology is growing concerningly under the garb of development. Now, the protagonists, they add a personal touch with the sense of belongingness to the narration of the tale on the island. They are the fictitious embodiment of us all in some way. And one of the best assets about this book is that it delivers the essence of the islands and most of its factual reports through a fictionally woven tale, which otherwise wouldn't have been interesting to most of the readers. This book is highly recommended to those who want to read and initiate about the lives of the tribal communities and other settlers of the island, and that should be all of us. So the author meticulously documents and weaves the history, the knowledge of the indigenous people, the tribes, the tribal life, and of the islands in this fictional work. So he conveys this unseemingly horrid side of the islands. The mainland India ought to read this book to acquaint themselves, to be cognizant of the fact that there is more to this exotic image of the Andaman and the Nicobar Islands. They ought to know the history, the present, the unseen future related to these islands, the beauty and the ugly side of the island. It is high time we prioritize, appreciate, and preserve the island's tribal communities and their culture before these very original indigenous people cease to exist and become headwinds and concise to the oblivion of the past. We need to understand that their communal lifestyle is far more acquainted and harmonious with and in nature, unlike us, the civilized concrete jungles.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Galicia, for your nice and vibrant presentation. And as we are time bounded, the next session will start at sharp at 11 o'clock. So
Yes, sir.
I have
sorry,
to.
sorry to disturb, sir. The session will
Yeah.
start at 11:10. So please,
Yeah.
the chair can make her discussion.
Yeah. Okay. 10 minutes extended. 10
Yeah.
minutes. Yeah. Okay. No problem, ma'am. Just a minute. And now, may I request the participants, if you have any questions, please put your question in the chat box. Otherwise, you may raise your hands to ask direct questions. And in between, I would like to invite the chairperson, Dr. Antara Datta, to flash some lights on the presenters and their presentations. So please, ma'am, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Mondal. Very, very fascinating presentations. I mean, I wish I had more time. I was just told about this session 15 minutes before it started. So I didn't have enough time to go over all the abstracts carefully. But, some observations and, some common concerns that I find, which have been raised by all the paper readers here. So these papers really offered a very kind of sharp and insightful observations of fictional narratives, of testimonies, and a discussion of polemic and contemporary political resistance, which are offered by marginalized communities. The papers also talked about our predicament, contemporary predicament, which is in fact a result of a very mechanical view of the world, of colonialism and its legacies, capitalist interests, and our very perverse ideas of our relationship with nature, our ideas of modernity and its legacies, and the way in which modernity, in fact, has has been engaged in a kind of century-long campaign of omnicide against the spirits of the earth, rivers, trees, and tribal imaginations. And these papers actually make a very strong and passionate case for the critical critical importance of political resistance through stories, through cultural practices, and of course, also giving voice to non-human narratives, which is nature, forests, mountains, hills, etc. So these seem to be the common concerns of all the paper readers. A few observations about some of the presentations. The first one, which was on the Adivasi Will Not Dance, again a very, very good presentation where Shubhangi talked about how the idea of the nation and the nation state is challenged, and how tribal life is being intruded upon not only by the machinery of the state, but also the collaborative forces of Brahminical hegemony and the repressive structures of the state. Also focused about gender exploitation of Adivasi women. There was a little, a little section where Shubhangi said that she was not going to read out certain portions because she thought it might be considered offensive. I wish she did read that bit out, because the whole point of these narratives is to actually shock us from our bourgeois morality and complacence. So it would have been nice if you did read it out, but a very powerful presentation. Then Carlos Lewis's argument, where he discusses Arijit Sen's graphic novel, on the Narmada Bachao Andolan. And while it was a very, very kind of good and insightful presentation, but it would have been, I would have liked to hear a little more about the form that Arijit Sen uses, which is the graphic novel, and why does he use that form in order to talk about this movement, and also his reading of mimicry. Again, slightly contentious, because he argues that the threat to indigenous cultures and lives also comes from the fact that these tribes are now imitating modern ways. If I'm reading correctly, you correct me if I'm wrong, because that's how I read it. It appeared to me that the onus of being victims or victimization somehow rested unfairly on people who suffered, who suffer against a state onslaught. A little more a critical force against the state, and the way in which the state is so engaged in destroying these life forms would have been perhaps something to think about. And then Sneha's presentation on Mamangdai, extremely good, fantastic. The reading of Mamangdai's works through the discourses of eco-criticism. Again, she talks about how the diversity of Northeast life, cultures have been homogenized, and she traces it back to, in fact, the colonial census, and how the contemporary Indian state, in fact, is a continuation of that practice. And also, she talks about very powerfully, again, through Mamangdai's work, how nature is given even voice. Nature is as much part of the life of the community as human beings are. This distinction between humans and nature, this dichotomy, in fact, does not exist, and how Mamangdai is using these concepts to offer a very sharp critique of the violence, which is done by the Indian state in the Northeast and to the Northeast tribes. And then Shrestha's a presentation on Mahashweta Devi, very, very interesting. She talks about cultural labor, and I thought that Shrestha and Shubhangi's kind of papers could be in conversation with each other. If we had more time, maybe we could do that, where where Shekhar is talking about how the Adivasi will not dance, and here Shrestha is talking about how culture becomes the main mode of resistance, as can be read in Mahashweta Devi's stories. and how subaltern art and practices and narratives become the source. The politics is kind of in a way constructed and crafted through these cultural expressions. And then Sneha's presentation on the personal narratives of Goan tribes, where she talks about this dichotomy between orality and the written record, and how more and more people are taking up writing in order to offer narratives of resistance. And there is a problematic there. What happens when you convert an oral culture and represent it through written forms? And that idea, the problematic of this process is something that she hints at. I wish she had more time to explore and explain it. And then, of course, finally, Galicia's representation, rereading of the island novel, which is about the Jaravas. Again, she brings up a very important kind of point, where she says that the Jaravas are again represented in a complex way. At one level, they are seen to be a repository of knowledge as far as forest lives is concerned, but on the other hand, they are also looked at through a prism of fear and anxiety, where they are seen to be dangerous people. But through all these presentations, as I said, what comes across is this very strong challenge to modernity, to neo-capitalism, to neo-colonialism, and how these narratives, these various forms of narratives from different parts, of the country, which all the paper readers have, talked about, how, you can see a kind of a sensibility emerging, a kind of politics emerging, and where I see there is a possibility of critical solidarities across these tribes, because come put together, despite their specific differences, and there could be differences in their cultural practices, etc. Of course, these are very widely different communities coming from widely different geographies as well. But there seems to be a collective resistance to forms of injustice, of violence, of by the state, which is, of course, being fueled by capitalist avarice and culture and capitalist modes of production. So thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to to listen to all of you. And if there are any questions that the audience has, maybe we can take them on. Anyone wants to ask a question? Dr. Mondal, do you want to take on the questions, or do you want me to read them out?
Yes, ma'am. We have got a question from Ritika Yadav.
Yeah.
And her question is to Galicia. Her question is, in the background of conflict between them and us, how difficult it is for Jaravas and other Andamanese tribe to claim for their identity, as they are dually vulnerable as tribal and as not being mainland tribe.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah, please.
the very first thing when it comes is that we have a language barrier when it comes to us and them. So that's the very first thing. And as I have said, Pankaj Seksaria actually is like a voice, acts as a voice to them. And I also said that we need to come up with a solution wherein we understand them, not they understanding us. So it's us who has to do the work, wherein we have to give them a space. It's us who is taking up all this, because we are saying we are superior than them, and that's the very thing that causes the problem. So we have to give them a space. So it's not, they are there, they are the first inhabitants and of the land, and we are the later comers. So we have to give them a space. They can't, because obviously there's a language barrier, and we are much more advanced than them in all the technology and stuff. but it's us who have to give them a space. They can't, so we have to give them a voice. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we don't overpower them in any other way. We have to see what they want as well. I hope I cleared her doubt.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your prompt answer to the question to Ritika Yadav. And now this is time to wind
Sir,
off.
so 1 minute.
Yeah,
Can I request all the paper presenters and the chair to open their cameras for a picture?
yeah. Please.
Thank you, sir.
Is it over?
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Now it is time for formal vote of thanks. So on behalf of JDMC and MGGC, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, I would like to thank the chair, Dr. Antara Datta, as she has spared her time and she has commented about prompt and vibration comments on today's program, as well as all the participants and their presentations. And at the same time, I would like to thank all the presenters for presenting their papers very eloquently and vibrantly with prompt examples. And I also extend my thanks to all the participants. And last but not the least, I thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you. Over to you, sir.